This week, we welcome back Shawn Metcalf. He's the founder and CTO of TriMark. Talk about Active Directory and Microsoft Cloud Security via Azure AD and Office 365. In our, first segment, I think is Mark, or no, our second segment is Mark. Sorry. In our second segment, we welcome Mark Cooper, president and founder of PKI Solutions, to discuss how Shaken and Stir in PKI will help end the global robocall problem. In the security news, Shark Tank star Barbara Corcoran loses $400,000 in an email scam. Experts warn of mass scans for Apache Tomcat Ghost Cat flaw. There's actually 3 flaws in there, but Tyler and I have spent way too much time looking at it, so we'll share what we know so far. Cisco patches remote code execution flaws in the WebEx player. Backdoor malware is being spread through fake security alerts. Let's Encrypt is revoking some certificates. And there was definitely some malware in there that was doing some funky things with AWS that I want to make sure we cover as well. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. NetSparker, the developers of a comprehensive automated web security platform that includes web vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management. NetSparker's desktop and cloud-based security solutions employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities and provides a proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at securityweekly.com/NetSparker. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach. Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise.
And welcome to the show. But first, let me introduce you to a man that wants you to smack his ass and call him Charlie, Mr. Paul Asadorian.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. It is episode number 642, and it is, in fact, what is it? March 5th, 2020. Sorry, my 2020, my teleprompter went off the rails. Again. No, well, you know what it was? I had, clicked it to advance, and it just kept advancing, and I wasn't paying attention. And so
running Tomcat, isn't it?
Anyway, I'm trying to, maybe it's pwned. Maybe it runs Tomcat. Welcome our established and esteemed host, Mr. Larry Pesci is here.
I am.
In studio.
Yes.
Nice to have you.
Formerly not at RSA, excuse me.
And not going to Way West Hacking Fest. Well, no. Going, but not to
virtually.
California. Virtually go. You're virtually going.
Virtually going.
Yes. Yeah. On the lines remotely, Mr. Jeff Mann is with us. Jeff, welcome.
Always good to be here virtually.
Yes.
If not in studio, and feel fairly fully recovered from RSA last week.
Agreed. Just maybe today I felt somewhat recovered.
Maybe just an hour or two ago.
Right. Mr. Lee Neely is with us remotely. Lee, welcome.
Hey, good afternoon. Great to be here from sunny California for at least a little while longer.
Very nice.
Get out while you can.
Mr. Joff Thayer is here with us as well. Joff, welcome.
Oh, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever the day is. Hey, yes, here.
Yes, it's beer o'clock. That's right. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us as well, remotely from an undisclosed location.
Buenos dias. Literally landed like 15 minutes ago in North Carolina for B-Sides Triad.
Yay. Fantastic. Alrighty, join us at InfoSec World March 30th through April 1st at Disney's Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners will save 15% off the InfoSec World main conference or World Pass. SecurityWeekly.com/ISW 2020. Click the register button and register with our discount code. If you want to sponsor a micro interview or a show that will be recorded live at the event, make sure that you fill out the form on SecurityWeekly.com/ISW 2020. Shawn Metcalf is here with us. He's the founder and CTO of TriMark a professional services company which focuses on improving enterprise security. He is one of about 100 people in the world who holds the Microsoft Certified Master Directory Services certification. Did I get that right, Shawn?
It sounds about right, yes.
And it's very nice to have you back on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Appreciate it, Paul.
So, Shawn, what have you been working on lately? We all, of course, follow adsecurity.org very closely to see what the latest things are that you folks are working on. So what's been happening in the world of Active Directory in security, as I'll call it?
Fair enough. A bit of a joke. Jared Haight, a friend of mine, he registered adinsecurity.org and decided to redirect it at adsecurity.org a while ago.
That's awesome.
So that was pretty funny. But yeah, I've been doing a lot of work focused on the Microsoft Cloud, specifically Azure AD and the Office 365 environment. That's what I've been looking at for the past few years now. I kind of kicked that off with a talk at DEF CON in 2017 with Taya, who was working at Microsoft's Azure Red Team at the time. And I talked a lot about what the recon could look like without actually having any access to the corporate environment or the cloud environment, and to discover and determine what is configured and what sort of applications are being used, cloud apps or otherwise. So that kind of kicked off that line of research for me. Really been looking at hybrid cloud over the past year or so, trying to figure out or actually probably more like 2 years, trying to figure out what sort of interesting security implications or ramifications occur when you are now connecting your corporate environment to a cloud environment, with a specific focus on obviously the Microsoft environment, because that's how I came up. Azure AD is the identity service for the Microsoft Cloud, and especially when you are moving, or many organizations have already moved into Office 365 or are moving there now, they have Azure AD as a backed component of that. And they are syncing their on-prem AD environment using Azure AD Connect to that Azure AD environment.
Oh, interesting.
So whether or not they know it, these organizations have it.
Yeah, I didn't realize that's how it worked. But now there's multiple paths, right? And I find it interesting because I always thought of it. I'm not, a Microsoft person, right? Like I read enough to be able to exploit something if I need or want to. By no means like I'm a Linux guy. But I always thought like you have Active Directory locally installed on premise, right? And when I want to move to the cloud, that I've got some options, right? I could basically do infrastructure as a service and just host the servers in the cloud. Or I always thought that Azure AD was like the same thing, and that Microsoft made it really easy. They could just I have a utility that points to my local AD, and they just transfer everything into Azure AD, and like I'm done. And there's automated tools to transform group policy, but it doesn't work like that, does it?
No, it doesn't. That's probably one of the most confusing things about it. Certainly the people at marketing at Microsoft really enjoy using the term Active Directory, so it's used over and over again. And Azure is very popular as well. Now, ATP seems to be the common buzzword that Microsoft likes to stamp on things. So, yes, it is confusing because when you say Active Directory, you kind of expect it to operate or act a certain way. Azure Active Directory is a cloud directory that is effectively a subset in some ways of what on-prem AD is, because there's no Kerberos, there's no LDAP, there's no NTLM. All the things that we're used to aren't there. And it's from a management perspective, you don't have group policy anymore.
Well, wait, back to the attackers. Hold on, wait, because we love NTLM and Kerberos and all those things. And those don't translate.
No, they don't. Although password spraying still does, as the folks, fine folks over at Black Hills has identified, as well as others. You can password spray against the Azure AD environment through Office 365, be it Exchange EWS or Blink or one of the other services that are exposed, because by default, all of these Office 365 tenants that are out there are enabled for legacy authentication, which is the old school authentication we're used to with SMTP, IMAP, POP, where it's just a username and a password. And they don't even understand MFA. So that means if legacy authentication is enabled for the Office 365 environment, which it is by default, then the attackers are password spraying that environment today and probably have compromised an account.
So, Shawn, what is the directory service and authentication mechanisms in Azure AD if it's not the technologies that we all know and love as attackers?
Right, great question. So you do get authentication with Azure AD. Microsoft has positioned Azure AD more as an identity provider, an IDP. So we're talking federation. The standard federation protocols work. So whenever you have something like when you need to connect through federation and the typical communication pathways through that works normally. You can log into your Office 365 environment through the web browser, login prompt, but the NTLM and Kerberos things are not there. In order to get that, you would have to sign up for something called Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is actually a Microsoft-hosted Active Directory environment where you don't get domain admins, you don't have any access to the domain controllers. It is just AD hosted as a service for you.
I got you.
And
So it's
Amazon
more like a SaaS.
has something similar in AWS. They have a Samba version, which is free or close to free, and then the actual Microsoft Active Directory, which costs some money. And then Google Cloud, the GCP environment actually has their own hosted Active Directory as well, which I believe is in beta.
So, Shawn, I mean, suffice it to say, if this were, you recommending an organization what to do, I imagine you're leaning heavily towards Azure to in those services to take care of any type of Active Directory deployment or upgrade or migration, right? Not necessarily going to Amazon, or is that in play for certain circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on what the customer needs. Realistically, if you're heavy into AWS, it doesn't really make sense for you to spin up this other thing in Azure and then try to make the connectivity or connection points between Azure and AWS. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think that's kind of why Amazon spun up their own. Last time I looked at it was in 2017, so it's been there for a while. Google has theirs now. I think the cloud providers have recognized that in an IaaS environment, when you spin up all these VMs, you've got to manage it somehow. And AD is kind of the de facto way to do that. So that way you can join them to this AD environment that is hosted in the cloud provider's data center effectively, and then you just have that access. With at least Amazon and Microsoft, that hosted AD in the cloud, you can use that as a resource for us. You can connect to it. You can provide some of the authentication pathways that you typically would with an Active Directory forest. So that provides some interesting things that are potential for an attacker, because if you see that there's a trust between the on-prem environment and this environment that's in effectively the cloud data center, be it AWS or Azure, then there's some interesting connectivity or connection points between that is part of what I've been looking at from a security perspective for hybrid cloud, be it SaaS, like the Office 365 suite, Azure, AWS from the IaaS component. I've been digging in a lot into those IAM roles that control who has access to what. I think it's pretty well understood that if, as a pen tester or an attacker, that you're able to compromise an account that has an IAM role that controls these virtual systems that are in, say, AWS, then you are able to take over those systems, extract data from them, things along those lines. And it gets really interesting when the organization has placed their domain controllers in that AWS environment or that IaaS environment for their on-prem Active Directory. So then you start looking at scenarios and situations where if you're able to connect somehow directly into the Azure or AWS IaaS environment, you can, and you have some sort of access, you might be able to leverage that to compromise Active Directory itself without actually touching the corporate network itself.
Yeah, and it just basically, you can assume a role based on your compromising of a user, a service, a system, because all of those assume some type of IAM role, which then translate into some type of Active Directory environment. Did I get that right?
Yeah, pretty much. And what's interesting about it is federation tends to play a role in that as well. So you'll have accounts that are on-prem that then actually have privilege rights to the IaaS environment in AWS, for example.
Yep.
And
is that via OAuth? Is that an OAuth? Is OAuth used to?
Yeah, so OAuth is definitely one of the protocols. Microsoft supports all the major standard federation protocols, and I believe they're actually on the board of a number of the open specs or the specs that are available for federation.
And OAuth is also what's used in Azure AD as well, correct?
Right.
It's supported in that environment.
Absolutely.
I thought I saw some potential like attack paths using OAuth, right?
Right. And I mean, it's been common with attackers. Trend Micro had a blog post about it a year or two ago where they were talking about a organization that they were tracking that actually had used OAuth to trick a user into clicking and accepting something called Google Defender. And that Google Defender would then have full control and access to their mail and their Google files. So what's interesting about that, just like an app on your phone, once you click, yes, I want this to have those permissions, then that app is going to have those permissions pretty much forever. So within the Office 365 environment, there is a consent for apps for users. There's a consent to apps for the enterprise itself, which is at the tenant or global admin level. Those are permissions that should be reviewed on a regular basis to make sure that they're appropriate. But at Black Hat last year, I spoke with Mark Murrow on stage about a number of different types of attacks against the Microsoft Cloud. And I'm pretty excited what I have in store for DEF CON and Black Hat this year, assuming I'm accepted.
That's awesome. Obviously, we won't ask you to spill the beans here on the show because you're going to present at the major.
I will say it's some really interesting hybrid cloud security research I've done, and I think I found a couple of interesting attack vectors that align with some of the things that I've mentioned so far on this show.
For organizations that are moving to some type of cloud environment to support Active Directory, what, in your opinion, Shawn, is the most common configuration today?
The most common configuration that we're seeing at Trimark is organizations that have done something with Office 365, usually because of Exchange Online. They want to get those mailboxes off their on-prem Exchange servers. They go ahead and migrate those up to Office 365. They have SharePoint configured. There are a number of challenges with that because, for one, it's pretty well known at this point that if you're able to compromise an Exchange server, you generally have rights over Active Directory itself. The problem is that these organizations that have migrated from their on-prem Exchange to Office 365, they still have an Exchange server. Microsoft actually gives you a license for a hybrid management Exchange server to remain on-prem. So that means there's still an Exchange server on-prem that's probably not that well protected. And typically, those rights are retained in the AD environment. So again, if you're able to compromise that Exchange server, or if you even pair it with the latest vulnerability that just came out, where if you were able to connect to the Exchange server remotely through a service that is open and available, as an authorized user, you're able to get system on it. And that's a pretty big deal at this point because there are a lot of organizations that have still been managing their own Exchange and exposing those services to the internet because they felt like, well, for a number of reasons, it was better for them to do it that way than moving to Office 365 or something like that.
Oh, I see. That's really interesting. With Office 365, and you said that has connections back into your local AD, and that's the most common. So people are still largely hosting Active Directory and managing that locally, and then there's a connector that basically connects that to your Office 365 account.
Right. I mean, call it a sync engine because that's what it is. It's Azure AD Connect that syncs up those users and groups information up to Azure AD. Dirk-Jan Malemo out of Europe has done some amazing research about attacking Azure AD Connect, attacking Office 365. I would imagine he's probably got about a dozen security incidents from Microsoft's MSRC at this point. He's been a prolific researcher, and I've been very impressed with what he's come up with, especially looking at those connection points between the Office 365 environment and the on-prem environment. Because when you do that connection, there's some, let's call them unintended consequences of how the security gets expanded. I certainly in my talk in 2017 at DEF CON, I spoke about Azure AD Connect often has the same sort of rights that Mimikatz DC Sync would need in order to pull credential material from domain controllers directly. And so because of that, the Azure AD Connect server is an attack surface, and a pretty big one. Most of the time when we do assessments for customers, we identify that the Azure AD Connect server is not protected really in any way beyond a standard server on the network.
And to gain access to that service, I need to fish a user that could be anywhere, right? As long as they're accessing Office 365, is that my entry point?
So it gets a little interesting because it depends on how the organization has configured Office 365. Within Azure AD, there's a technology called Conditional Access. With Conditional Access, you can effectively firewall off by identity or location who is allowed to connect to or access certain types of resources. The challenge with this for most organizations is you only get conditional access when you actually subscribe and purchase a license model called Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or Azure AD P1. So it does cost some extra money, and that's for all users in order to be able to get that capability. Without that, you're at the default where basically the internet can connect or attempt to connect to your Office 365 environment. And in Black Hat last year, I talked about how you could use different types of Python or PowerShell or other tools to connect directly to Office 365 to even guess to see what email addresses are valid for that tenant. There's a tool called O365 Creeper, which is pretty interesting, and it takes advantage of the fact that if you provide an invalid email address for a tenant or for Office 365, it gives one status code back. But if it's a valid one, it gives you a different status code back. So effectively, you just give it a text file of email addresses, run it against your Office 365 or the Office 365 environment at large, and then it'll tell you which of those email addresses are valid and which ones aren't. And once you have that, then you can pivot over to do password spraying, which of course typically works pretty easily. And once you get that one user account, then you can dump the list of the users that are in that environment, and then pivot by spear phishing or something like that. So there's, you can go after the cloud environment to then try to make your way back to the on-prem environment. I did work with one customer and identified that they were syncing their AD passwords up to Office 365, but they had no real additional protections of that. And the worst part of it was that their VPN environment did not require two-factor. So I walked through a scenario with them where I said, look, all I need to do is password spray your users. I'm probably going to get someone. And then I can use that credential that from password spraying Office 365 in order to then connect to your VPN without MFA, without two-factor. Now I'm in your corporate network.
Right. That's awesome.
Interesting. So can you kind of alluded a little bit to some of the caveats of the different licensing tiers, something like the E3, E5. So there's the DoD, which the DoD tenancy, which also has some different tiers there. Can you talk to some of the protections or considerations that maybe people need to consider as they're looking at O365 or federated migrations, and then touch on maybe some considerations around those licensing tiers when they're looking at something like MA or MDM with like Intune with the BYOD stuff. So these all are different vectors in which obviously O365 is now providing some awesome attack scenarios, and without the appropriate license, that causes some serious issues, correct?
It absolutely does. And you're right, Tyler. I think probably the biggest confusion that comes with Office 365 is that you have Office 365 E3, which is pretty much email, and the use of the Office application. And then you have Office 365 E5 or Enterprise 5, which gives you a lot of the things that you get as part of Office 365. A lot of customers believe that when they got Office 365 E5, they have everything, which isn't true. There's other P1s and P2s that are available in order to get Azure Information Protection, in order to get Intune, in order to get things like, again, the Azure AD P1 and P2. There's a subscription bundle which includes most of the things that customers would want, such as Azure AD P1 to get conditional access, Intune, as well as Azure AD P1, and a couple of the other things as part of that. And that's part of the Enterprise Mobility and Security bundle. Again, there's a P1 version or a Plan 1 version of that, and a Plan 2, which maps to basically 1 or 2 or 3 or 5. And then on top of that, there's actually a subset of everything called Microsoft 365. And there's an E3 license for that, which includes a Windows 10 Enterprise license. And then there's a Microsoft 365 Enterprise 5 license, which is actually everything that you could possibly get. That's Azure ATP, which is effectively like the advanced threat analytics that you would have on-prem monitoring your Active Directory environment. Azure ATP, despite the fact that it says Azure, is actually for your on-prem Active Directory environment and does the same thing, except Azure itself handles the server side of the data that's being crunched to figure out, okay, what sort of attacks might be going against your on-prem AD. So you get that with that superset license. And then the other part that you get is the Windows Defender ATP, which is for your endpoints, which is actually a very strong EDR that pretty much anytime I talk to pen testers or red teamers, and maybe Tyler has his own opinion on this, but it seems like the ones that they hate going against is CrowdStrike Falcon and Windows Defender ATP, which says a lot to me that Microsoft has been able to grow that in the past few years.
Well, it's a good thing Microsoft hasn't made their product line confusing. Makes perfect sense.
The licensing certainly has not gotten simpler.
There's plenty of opportunities to screw that up.
So I want to just touch on. Oh, go ahead, Joff. Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to make a comment. I will fully admit I was on an on-site a couple of weeks ago, and the metrics that the customer was getting was out of ATP, and it was pretty good. I mean, I have to admit.
Come a long way, baby.
So Microsoft.
You start to tune ATP, and it's a bad day. It's a bad day for us. Once those things are locked down, you got some good heuristics put around that. You add a good SIM and an EDR in conjunction with something like Windows Defender across an enterprise, or even Carbon Black in conjunction with that. And honestly, that's probably one of the worst tests you'll end up having to do.
Yeah, it's pretty strong.
So, Shawn, if you could speak to how most folks are deploying ATP and what it is, as well as kind of the different tiers of Windows Defender, because I think, if you get Windows, it comes with Defender, but does it really? So there's a lot of nuances in there, right?
There are, and so of course it is a bit confusing as you kind of sort of dig through it. With the Windows 10 Enterprise license, you actually have access to something called attack surface reduction rules, which are kind of baked in. This is where it's kind of the extension of the old Emmet project, which was spun up within MSRC effectively, and then got deployed at enterprises, 100,000, 200,000 seats. But the attack surface reduction rules have the ability to block files or applications from spawning processes from things like Office documents, blocking Win32 API calls from Office documents, blocking executables from running off of USB drives. A lot of really, basically the core ways that attackers would move or compromise a system can be blocked by those attack surface reduction rules. So as far as licensing goes,
attack surface reduction rules are part of Windows Defender.
So here's where it gets interesting. It's part of the Windows 10 Enterprise license, and I believe it's also with education, but don't quote me on that.
Sure.
But Defender you get with Windows regardless. Defender antivirus. Microsoft has also renamed the firewall Windows Defender Firewall. So when we're talking about Windows Defender that you get with Windows, it's Windows Defender Antivirus. Mm-hmm. So Windows Defender Antivirus has to be turned on because that's the blocking mechanism or engine that's used for these attack surface reduction rules.
Gotcha.
Then you layer on the Defender ATP license, which then gives you all this other capability, your typical EDR. It also gives you vulnerability reports off the system, does some asset management. Wow. Really cool kind of capability because there's also a really strong threat intel team that Microsoft is homegrown effectively that's behind the Defender ATP team.
So basically, Microsoft has their own EDR endpoint security agent. And I'm sorry, what did you call it? The Windows Enterprise what now?
Exactly.
So if I want like Microsoft's endpoint security above and beyond what comes with Windows, which is the Windows Firewall and Windows Defender, what is that called?
Maybe.
You want Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, or ATP.
Okay. So
that's Defender ATP. There's also Office ATP, which is for Exchange Online.
Yep.
And then there's also the Azure ATP, which is for your on-prem AD environment.
Azure ATP is for my on-prem AD environment?
Azure
That's
AD
not
ATP.
confusing at all.
Wow.
Wait, what?
Wow. But the Azure ATP.
I got another one for you if you want to hear it.
Well, wait, the Azure ATP, Shawn, is that what does that sit on my domain controller or sniff packets? Like, Is it sit in between?
Actually, yeah, it's an agent that you install in your domain controllers, just like you would do with Advanced Threat Analytics or ATA.
That's what I was thinking of. Advanced Threat Analytics. No, that's
right.
Is that still a separate thing, or is that merged into ATA?
ATA is still a separate thing.
Okay.
It's an on-prem thing, and realistically, my opinion is that's going to go away at some point, and Azure ATP is going to take it over because there's a lot more analytics that Microsoft can do with Azure ATP versus the on-prem server component. But effectively, they work the same way. There's a sensor agent that gets installed on your domain controller that then sends the authentication data that's relevant to the ATA server on-prem or the Azure ATP instance within Azure.
I got you. That's very similar to a vendor that a sponsor that we work with called Preempt. Have you seen Preempt before?
I know Preempt really well.
Yeah. So they do similar stuff. Okay, so now I'm starting to, I think, get it. So
you're probably.
I'm looking for a matrix.
Yeah, I was going to say,
you need to send us a diagram, Sean. So
I was going to say,
I'll put
Paul, you and Sean may be the only two people in existence.
There's Azure Active Directory password protection, which is actually for your on-prem environment.
Oh, wow.
But does it work in the same way where you have to do an agent to connect it?
I just want to talk. I want to talk briefly just about cost, Sean, and I don't expect you to know what all the pricing is. But like in comparison, I've got these great services from Microsoft that can basically give me an EDR from Microsoft, right, and protect not just my endpoints, but also my domain controller, right? And then, where am I going with this? So what's the price? It's all very confusing. So now what if I went to an endpoint vendor and were to buy agents for all of my things, and then I'm going to other vendors maybe to protect my domain controllers? Like, are there price differences, or is it really just kind of all over the map?
Quite honestly, I haven't done that comparison personally. I can tell you that there is a threat protection bundle that Microsoft has, which I think is around $12 to $15 per user or something like that, which includes all the ATPs. So Defender ATP, Office ATP, Azure ATP, and there's probably another one that I'm forgetting.
Now, there's also a school of thought. Let's go right with Microsoft, right? So I bought that. It's $12 per user. I like it. I've been hearing good things about it. I also want to put Sysmon on all my systems and use that to collect logs. And now this also this gives me vulnerability, asset, and endpoint protection, and some visibility with Sysmon into processes running on Windows systems and other logging. Do I need to go buy something else other than maybe a logging and correlation engine to sift through all of this?
So yeah, realistically, the goal would be to have something that pulls all this together, right?
Yeah.
Microsoft launched Azure Sentinel around the same time that Google launched Chronicle. I think it was March, around the same time last year. The nice thing or interesting thing about Azure Sentinel is it's in Azure. It lives there. It's the query language KQL is pretty easy to figure out. The nice thing about that is if you have Office 365, you can get those logs into Azure Sentinel without spending a whole lot of money on it because those logs import directly.
So there's also Azure Sentinel.
I'm sorry?
Azure Sentinel that's pretty much like my Elk Stack or, Humio or Log. I mean, there's like a laundry list of, I see a new vendor like every other week in this space. And no knock on them. I mean, they're all doing, well, not all of them, but many of them are doing really good work, right? Some are catching up, some get acquired or whatever, but Microsoft also has their own offering.
Right. And I will say that they did a couple of things that was really smart with Azure Sentinel. One, they launched at the exact same time a GitHub repository of IOCs, alerts, awesome. All the things that you go, okay, now what do I do? Because my biggest complaint with SIM vendors is you buy the SIM and then you go, okay, now what? And they say, well, you configure it for your environment. You build alerts. And then you ask the SIM vendor, okay, but aren't these pretty much the same for most environments? And the SIM vendor goes, well, maybe, but you still need to build the alerts for your environment. Or you pay for a package that then will sit in there and do some analysis and figure that out. But I mean, realistically, I published ways on how to detect password spraying on your on-prem AD environment. I published detections for Kerberoasting on your on-prem environment. Things like that are universal. And the thing that I really like about the fact that Microsoft launched a GitHub is this is the repository where you can pull these queries from it and put those right into Azure Sentinel, copy, paste, adjust. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Sigma project, which is incredible because Sigma has a tremendous library of indicators and is put together in a language which can then be converted to most SIM vendor language or query. And that way you can basically take those from Sigma and put them right into your SIM if you're still trying to figure out, like, what am I supposed to use to detect certain things.
That's pretty cool. So is it still, largely organization dependent on what technologies that I use to cover? I like to talk about I call them my enchanting quadrants, right? So you're collecting some network telemetry, you've got some logs, and you've got endpoint, and you've got some threat intelligence as well to round out 4 quadrants. Sounds like you could do all of that probably with Microsoft's technology.
I think that you could do all of that with several vendors, and again, I'm Microsoft focused, so obviously I'm looking at the Microsoft stuff as well. But you look at a CrowdStrike to have a solid EDR, and they do managed like a managed MSSP type thing. So with that, which is interesting, Microsoft has a component for Defender ATP on that as well. So the Defender ATP lights up a bunch of additional telemetry within Windows 10. So you get some interesting stuff around that. So I would say you don't even really need Sysmon necessarily, unless you're going to port that into an actual other logger.
Okay.
But what's interesting is with Microsoft's, they have the telemetry, they have this knowledge about all the systems and what's happening. You get something like Defender ATP, Office ATP, Azure ATP, and all these things start talking to each other and put that and load that information into your SIM or that aggregated log engine along with some NetFlow. And like Tyler was saying, that's going to be a really tough time for anyone who's trying to compromise that environment or operate in it, because the typical things that you would do are likely to get detected.
Now,
and
but
then
Shawn,
on top of that, you got to get the Azure AD sign-in logs, the Office 365 logs, which I think is a miss for a lot of organizations.
But this is still now all Windows based. If I've got Linux or Mac OS or Chrome OS or whatever.
Well, actually, Defender ATP will work on Linux. It'll work on Mac. It'll work on, I believe it's Windows 7 and 2008 R2 and newer.
Okay. So they are supporting other platforms. That's really, they're a major player now in the security space, which is interesting.
They are. I believe that they support Linux through a PAM, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure I am. But there's effectively a plugin for the Defender ATP client or agent that goes into Linux. And there's been a lot of work in that area from Microsoft.
That must be weird being like a Linux engineer working at Microsoft, though. Just saying, But I think their culture has changed where maybe that's probably not a big deal anymore.
Well, I think once Satya came in, it was like a whole new world.
I was going to say, you got Bash on Windows.
Right, yeah.
PowerShell on Linux.
Yeah, and you get the Windows subsystem for Linux now, and when WSL2 comes out, you actually have a real Linux kernel in Windows.
Yeah, so when's it going to do raw sockets, for Christ's sake?
For the love of God, please.
For the love of God, exactly.
Oh, God.
What breaks for you guys without raw sockets? Much of your Nmap, sure. Yep. Yeah, some of the exploit code, right?
Responder, all the shit I like to use, basically.
Yeah.
Everything good.
But you can run LS instead of DIR now.
There's that.
You can, and when you make a mistake, that's handy, right? Like you always are LSing when you should be DRI.
I can use an alias for that. I didn't need an entire subsystem.
Well, actually, PowerShell has an alias for you. There's LS, there's man, there's a bunch of typical Bash commands.
Hey, look, I'm a closet PowerShell fan. I have to admit.
Not anymore. You're not.
Yeah, you don't know why do you need to be in the closet with PowerShell?
Just came out of the closet there, buddy.
Whoop.
And PowerShell 7 just went GA, and that's really slick across all platforms pretty much now.
That's crazy. My head's spinning with just all the different products and offerings from
Bold new Microsoft.
Yeah, it really is.
So,
other questions for Shawn?
Yeah. So one of the questions is I'm thinking about this. I know folks that get real nervous about one source for all that cool stuff. How do we answer the question that if I don't have best of breed from 7.3 different vendors, there's no way in hell it's going to work right? Or maybe not quite so blunt as that, but you know what I'm saying.
Oh, I absolutely know and understand. We have customers that have said they've been told by their executives, we need to be in every cloud. So they're in Azure, they're in AWS, and they're in GCP. And anyone who has done any kind of cloud work knows that is incredibly confusing, because while you would have something that might be called a subnet or a VLAN in your on-prem environment, in Azure it's called one thing, and AWS is called another, and then GCP, I believe it's called something else. So there's different names for capabilities. There's different names for what those core components actually are. And then there's differences in capability and focus by the vendor on what security controls can actually be placed there. Some are provided by the cloud provider itself. Others, there's a third-party market that you have to plug into. So I would say that in cloud, it can definitely make things more confusing and difficult if you want to, let's say, distribute across the three major players in cloud, especially from an IaaS perspective. I think one person I spoke to recently said, yeah, we didn't want to get locked into one vendor, so we decided to get locked into three.
Not only do you have to secure one vendor, you also have to secure the three vendors that now interconnect those three vendors that then have a subsystem that have to send logs out to three other systems.
Absolutely. And then the IAM across all three of them, plus the different role names, and then you have to track back to figure out what each of those IAM roles capability are in each three of them, or each one of those three. Yeah, it's incredibly complex. Like just
and that's how you get insecure databases.
Yeah. So
Right.
I've got a question for Shawn. Is that actually a closet you're sitting in?
It's not. It's a side of my office where I just kind of put up my badges and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Okay. It just
So
looked like you
I
were
don't
sort of
live or
hiding
work in a
back
closet. It's more of a cave.
Awesome. I see. I was thinking it might have been like part of the workshop in the garage, but nope.
Some
Okay.
call it a cave, some call it a closet. Maybe it's a bat cave,
Some call it a bat closet.
So
Shawn, I wanted to ask you about the migration path. If I have Active Directory on premise, should everyone be moving to Azure AD? Is that like utopia, or not?
That's a very good question, and I think a lot of organizations are grappling with that question today. I definitely see it on the roadmap. I don't know that that's entirely feasible today, primarily because the thing that everyone's using for management of the Windows systems and systems in the environment in general is group policy. We don't have group policy in Azure AD, so what do we have? We have to use an MDM. So if we're staying pure Microsoft, then we're looking at Intune. And Intune, there is
Wait,
not
hold
a
on,
direct
Shawn, back up.
correlation.
So MDM, that's not mobile device management, right?
It is.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
Oh, so you use MDM, is it like Azure AD, MDM, Enterprise, ATP? Is that what?
No, it's Intune. No Azure
Intune,
involved.
Intune, right?
Yeah, it's Microsoft Intune, which is capital I, lowercase n, Tune. So yeah, it's Intune, and Microsoft has been building Intune to be more of a Windows system management platform as well as your typical mobile devices like iPhone, Android.
Oh, interesting. So they're combining the mobile management with the endpoint management.
Right, exactly. And so what's interesting about Intune at this point is that they've actually put together some security policies that have some good controls around Windows 10. And so if you go through and enable all those, you have a pretty strong platform from a Windows 10 perspective. The thing that's annoying for me with Intune is that you have these categorized policies. So you might have to have 3 or 4 different policies just because each one of them covers a category, and the settings within that category don't flow into other policies. In group policy, I can go ahead and create 1 policy or 2 policies that have all the stuff that I need. In Intune, I need more like 4 or 5.
I gotcha.
But also that gives you the flexibility, though, and the control to deploy something like an MAM against non-enrolled devices. So that BYOD then plays into the ability to sandbox applications and corporate data with inside of, say, something like Outlook on both iOS and Android. You don't actually have to enroll these devices. They can BYOD, but you can also protect and sandbox and isolate the data and bring in something like RMS, where Azure RMS is then securing and providing the encryption layer for MAM and MDM as far as a BYOD device, right?
That was a lot of acronyms, Tyler.
Holy, absolutely.
Wow.
There's a drink penalty in there somewhere, Tyler. Sorry, dude.
So wait, I think the only 2 I might not know of, and I could be mistaken, RMS and MAM.
So RMS has been renamed to Azure Information Protection.
Oh, well, that's not
basically,
confusing at all.
yeah, it's basically a DRM. So you take the file, you put it into an encrypted envelope. and there's a variety of different keys that provide different levels of access. So,
Gotcha.
for example, Paul, I could send you a document and you could read and edit it. I could send the same document to you and Tyler in the same email, but Tyler could just view it, could not print it, could not edit it. And if he says I have a typo on page 10, I could actually change the control settings on that file in real time, and then he would have access to it.
And that Trusted Sec had a blog post on that they were using it in an attack scenario, right?
Right, because it usually goes right through the scanners.
Right, because if it's encrypted like that, it bypasses the scanners.
So
that's an organization policy to make sure that there's actually something around that, so that there's some protections for how do you handle the encrypted content that's under Azure Information Protection, for example. But I just want to get back to something Tyler said real quick. Absolutely, being able to control and manage your Windows systems like Windows 10, in addition to your mobile platform, has some really interesting power to it, because one of the challenges with organizations today are they're highly mobile. These computers are traveling all over the place, and the problem we saw was we needed always-on VPN in order to ensure that they could connect back to something like SCCM to get updates, to get pushed-out applications and things like that. Now, when you're talking about Intune, they can move anywhere they want in the world. I know of organizations that actually just order computers. They drop ship directly to the office locations. The person turns on the computer, it starts up, it automatically Azure Active Directory joins. Intune policies get deployed to it, including applications, and the user is up and running just like that. So that part of it is actually really cool.
Now, what's MAM?
MAM is Mobile Application Management.
Okay, I gotcha.
So that's control around what applications can actually run. Microsoft also has their own CASB, their Cloud Access Security Broker. And what's interesting about that is if you feed their CASB the network traffic or even just the data from your perimeter firewalls, you can then start identifying what's happening in your environment, what cloud apps are being used, what sort of data is transiting your firewall and your perimeter.
Well, that's interesting. Wow.
Do I recall right that there's also a foray into the zero trust space as well from Microsoft, or coming from Microsoft?
So Microsoft's perspective on zero trust is it all starts with positive control, and it starts with the limiting who has privileged access to the system, and then you start building it out from there. Alex Weinart actually did a great talk. I believe it was at Ignite several months ago, Microsoft's Ignite conference, and I think he did one at RSA as well that spoke about Microsoft's and the concept of zero trust and how it builds from how you can manage these systems no matter where they are, as well as making sure that they have the secure security tools laid down on them. You have the visibility into what's going on with them. You also have the management, application deployment, patching, etc., from those systems, regardless of where they are. All the zero trust stuff starts from that core concept and then builds on that, because if you don't have positive control of your endpoints, you don't have good visibility into them, then obviously zero trust is not going to be something that's very effective.
Any more questions for Shawn?
I mean, we could talk all night, but
Yeah, we mentioned a lot of technologies on the surface. And
yeah, I can add one thing to the Intune conversation with Win 10. One of the things that I've been playing with is the application, the device control through Intune. Basically, Microsoft has a switch for that. It's application whitelisting that's rooted in effectively the hardware, where I can deploy a policy to my systems and say only allow applications that Microsoft knows and trusts and nothing else. So I've tested this out. It works pretty well. I can run common applications that are run pretty much everywhere, but then things that Microsoft doesn't recognize or sees more broadly deployed, like even 7-zip, it just won't run.
I had one other question. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lee. No, go ahead, Lee.
So I had a question based on something somebody told me the other day. They said in the device management space, you had the ability there was the ability to control what could be backed up by a user, which is really interesting in the BYOD space, where you don't necessarily want corporate data to be taken somewhere else and restored outside of rights management, let's say. Was that based on something real, or was somebody making stuff up?
I'm not sure. I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, I should have researched that question a little better. My apologies.
Okay.
But
So Paul asked me earlier about, what are customers doing and how are they going? They're not really making it to Azure AD yet, but they are definitely making inroads to moving in that direction. And one of the things that organizations are looking at are lifting and shifting applications from their on-prem environment and putting it into, say, Azure AD directory services or something like that. Or the other thing that they're doing right now is there's a way to use Azure AD seamless single sign-on so that you authenticate to Azure AD, and then you're able to connect back into your on-prem environment and connect to your applications to use those as well. So there's some really interesting things that have been happening in this space. Microsoft is definitely doing some things. I know Zscaler has some things that they've been doing in the space as well. But it's interesting, this definite blend between what's cloud, what's on-prem. I think we're going to see a lot more blending of that, and really a breakdown of what is truly the perimeter and what the role that the firewall has traditionally provided for us.
What security risks do you see with kind of leveraging those eventual migrations to something like single sign-on, or migrating to, say, O365 tenancy with the migration path or the security roadmap to kind of move over to a federated service? Like, what kind of things should we be looking at, considering? And from an attacker side, what are the kind of current landscapes for attacks?
Great questions. So Dirk-Jan Malema, who I mentioned earlier, had done a talk at Troopers last year in Germany about basically taking advantage of this seamless single sign-on configuration. And part of the issue was because there was a computer account that was created in AD and the password didn't change. So if you're able to control that computer account password, then you could effectively spoof an Azure AD seamless single sign-on authentication to Active Directory and then impersonate users. So almost like a golden ticket, but a smaller version of that. So I think we're really going to see a lot of interesting things with this hybrid cloud security model and what that actually means, especially in the threat landscape as organizations open things up more. As they move into the cloud and cloud services, they've more formalized these cloud services that might have started with shadow IT and now are things that the IT is actually accepting. But I'd say one of the biggest risks today is that executives see an ad in the airport or maybe at RSA and go, okay, yeah, we're moving to the cloud. And then operations and security is kind of like, okay, how do we do this? Well, what exactly are we supposed to be doing? Operations moves the best they can, gets users migrated into, say, Office 365, and security goes, I think we're secure, I think we're good. But it's a huge paradigm shift for everybody. There's a learning curve. It costs money to figure out. I mean, as it is, I have 3 different test tenants to test out different scenarios. One of them is my big megacorp that has something like 80,000 users, so I can test out different scenarios. But it gets challenging to do things like that and really test things out because of cost, of time. And like I said, this is a big paradigm shift, and it's new to people. And then don't even take the fact that the cloud kind of moves from underneath your feet right when you get used to it because of the DevOps model of cloud. Every week, every month, every quarter, there are things that are changing and new capabilities are available. I'd say that's tough for organizations as well. Say Microsoft rolls out a new security feature that most people actually have subscribed to it. But is it enabled? Is it configured? Are logs coming from it that matter? That's a big question mark right now.
Shawn, that was awesome. I think my final question is, in your assessment, what's the overall level of knowledge of all of these services, either existing or not? Do people know that all of this stuff exists? And what's the knowledge of the teams that you're working with in all of these, especially newer technologies?
I would say for most of our customers that reach out that have questions about this, they are just trying to figure it out. And the questions are always, is there a book that I can read? Unfortunately, not. Are there articles that really lay out what could be done to secure like an Office 365 environment? There are a couple that Microsoft have, but I don't think they're as comprehensive as what we need. I'm working on one for that. I mean, at TriMark, we work with customers in security assessments for on-prem AD as well as the cloud. So we're trying to put some of that together and publish it so that way, so there's some good information for people. But I mean, the challenge is the people that are doing operations and doing security, they're fighting the fight. They're doing what they need to do. They're working through their regular day job. Now they have cloud thrown in as well. I mean, what's been the greatest myth that is in IT? It's okay, we're going to move to this new system, right? Yeah, but the old system sticks around forever. You know, they have an AD forest, they acquire another company, they set up a trust, and then now that company has 2 AD forests, or in the instance of some of our customers, 100 Active Directory forests.
Wow.
So this older systems, older applications, older whatever, they never go away. So now we have a situation where they have Office 365, which operations and security has to figure out what the security implications of that means, as well as continuing doing all the on-prem AD things and dealing with budgets and resources and security challenges and patches. So I would say that everyone's trying the best they can, but it really, I mean, the cloud to me is kind of like the Wild West. There's a lot going on. And even, like I said, switching from Azure to AWS or from AWS to Azure, or even from VMware to one of those, because like the cloud, IaaS is effectively virtualization writ large.
Yep.
So you go from VMware to Azure, different terminology. A lot of the same things, but different terminology.
So
it is, and then
I'll turn that question real quick. And are you seeing the same kind of issues from the offensive standpoint of companies not knowing how to properly test or do security assessments, or even know what security assessments and checks to kind of conduct against the Azure or cloud environments?
I would say yes, Tyler. I mean, I would say, based on my opinion and just a basic survey of the industry and the market, when we get asked, you know, who can do these things, there's a handful of pen tester companies that we could really point to or say, well, go ahead and take a look at this company, because again, it's a whole new skill set, or it's another skill set. And if you're working as a pen tester and you're doing, I don't know, 10 to 20 to 50 pen tests a year, when do you have time to figure out what this cloud thing means? And it's sort of the same challenge, but just in a slightly different manner around that. I mean, I've been in or had a presence in Microsoft Office 365 for over 10 years now, when it was Exchange Online. I've been looking at that for since the 2016, 2017 timeframe. So it's been 3 or 4 years at this point, and I feel like I'm still trying to read as fast as possible to keep up with what's going on and really focus on it. It's a huge challenge in the industry, and I think it's not one that's going to be solved anytime soon. You talk about the lack of people in the InfoSec community or industry, or being able to hire people. I'd say cloud security is probably a more looming pending issue than even what we have more broadly for InfoSec.
I think many of us, security and blue team and our ops, are all behind in some way, because what I found, at least in my experience in my career, right, is you got to learn how to build stuff. And when we talk about this newer cloud technology, whether it's Microsoft or not, there are very few really good resources that are showing you how to build your stuff for production. We've had this conversation a lot here at Security Weekly, and Tyler's already laughing, right? Because you see maybe some examples, but like, that's not how you do it in production. And largely we're figuring out that stuff on our own. Now, the first step in this whole process is you got to learn how to build it. Once you learn how to build it, the next step is learning how to defend it. And if there's not a lot of resources to learn how to build it, there certainly are not a lot of resources to learning how to defending it and securing it. Then the third step is, once I've built it and secured it, now I got to learn how to break into it, right? And these may happen at different times, but it's the same problem. There's not that many people posting information about how to break into it, because quite frankly, if they do, they probably don't want to let their secret out of the bag either, right?
Well,
Jeff?
No.
But when the cloud provider told me it was great to go to the cloud, it was because they promised security.
Yeah. No, it was
All rainbows and unicorns.
It's a great point, Jeff. It is. In a lot of, I think, the marketing around that, to your point, Jeff, is, well, just come host it in our cloud and it'll magically be secure. And there's no magic in that process, right? It's really just about hard work and testing and all that other stuff, not magic.
Right, and I would say, building onto that, one of the biggest misconceptions with cloud in general is that organizations kind of expect that the cloud provider is going to handle security, even in an IaaS scenario, which really doesn't make sense. But there's a shared responsibility, even in a SaaS perspective, making sure that your credentials are protected, that you're not giving everyone admin rights. I mean,
but the sales guy didn't talk to me about shared responsibility.
Right.
He told me it was going to be cheaper and more secure.
Right.
Absolutely right.
True.
It's true.
Well, Shawn, thank you so much for coming on Paul Security Weekly this evening. It was a great conversation. I learned a lot. I think we set a record for maybe the most buzzwords used in one segment.
And or acronyms.
Yeah.
Azure ATP.
Yes.
I drank a lot. I know that.
Yeah. Thanks so much,
Sean.
Shawn.
The buzzwords around. I don't even have a drink here. This is horrible.
And you're in the Delta Lounge and you have no drink? What the?
I know, right?
What the hell?
Drinks are free in there, Tyler. Well, Shawn, thank you again. TriMark Security as well as adsecurity.org. Make sure you check out those fabulous resources.
Thank you.
With that, we'll take a short break, come back with our next interview. Stay tuned.